Hi everyone and welcome back to this C++ tutorial series on creating plugins for Cinema 4D. So what we're going to do today is we're going to work on creating an object. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a new object that's basically going to be the same as the cube object, but we're going to write this ourselves. And when we create this object, it's going to allow us to select it in an interface, and it will add a cube to the scene, and you'll see it listed up here in the object manager. So jump back into the code here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create two new files for this. And I'm no longer going to use the method that I was showing in here, such as add new item, because if you do this, it always defaults to the wrong location here, so this shouldn't be in this location. And so I'm just going to start doing it manually instead. And I'm going to go to the folder, C code SDK plugins, first plugin source. So we're going to add two new files into here, and these are going to be just called, we'll just go with our first naming. I'm going to call it first object. Then I go new text document first object.h, and then I'll just copy and paste that and rename that to .cpp. Let me change the extension. So there's our two files there for our first object. And now we just need to make sure that the project is updated to include it. So we just go to the SDK folder here, the code folder, and we run our build SDK script that we wrote in the very first tutorial. And you can see there it's updated the project. So if I close these down, and back in here it's going to say it wants to reload. We just go reload all, and we'll see our files are now over here. And I'm going to do the same thing I did in the previous tutorial as well. I'm just going to do the wrapper at the top, hash not include, define, if not define, first object h, hash define, hash endif. And I've typed that in wrong there. That should be if not define. Okay, and we're going to go class first object public base object. Not base object, object data. And we also want to include the c4d.h, and we'll do public up the top here, and then we'll write our constructor, and we'll write our destructor as well, virtual first object. So we'll just set this up in the CPP file as well. Copy all that, go over to the CPP file, paste that in. First thing we want to do is include first object, and then we copy this first object, get rid of that. I'm going a little bit faster now because a lot of this stuff should be a little bit familiar with you now from the previous tutorials, even if my typing is still a little bit too bad. So there we have the basics of our class, and we also want to be able to allow this to get registered. So we want to register this class as well, and to do that you need to add another method. And I'm just going to find an example of this. Just going to search this within the entire code base. And we'll find examples of other objects. There's a lot of the objects obviously in the example SDK. So let's just choose this object data heart example. And you know, you can look through all of these and you'll find ways of implementing all these as well in here. So I'm just going to go in here and grab this line here. It's an allocation method. And go back into our class and paste this in. Node data, and we want to return a new object of our own class, and this is some error handling. Now I'll just keep using this first, and then I'll describe what all these bits are. But the basics of this is having a static method called alloc allows us to call this from outside of this method, and we want to call this from a register function. So I'm just going to do this in the CPP file. At the bottom down here, I'm going to go bool register first object. And again, I'm just going to go back to any of these examples, and I'm going to scroll down. I'll just search for register object, and that's what we want there. So I'm just going to copy that, go back to our file, paste it in. So register object plugin, that's what we're actually going to be registering. And I can take out a lot of this stuff. You just pass in. I'm going to leave object generator in there, and I'll go through these one at a time and change these over. So register object is the function that we can call to register an object. It takes quite a few parameters, and we'll just go through them, just briefly, because they take a lot of different options depending on what you want to use your object for. So the first thing we need is our ID that we're going to get from Plugin Cafe. So as I come over to Plugin Cafe, plugincafe.maxon.net, and we click on this plugin ID over here, and we're going to say this is our ID for our first object. Then click Get Plugin ID, and now we can copy that ID here. And I just created this new account specifically for these tutorials, so I might see a few warnings like the one I just closed down there. So this is the ID that we want to use. It's our own ID. No one else in the world will get this number if they come to Plugin Cafe and get their own plugin ID from here. This is unique just to you. And so we're going to copy that, and I'm going to do a define at the top. Hash define ID first object, and I'm just going to put that there. So again, the define says we can use this text, and it's going to replace it with that when it gets compiled. These are called macros, but I just refer to them as hash define because that's kind of what you type. And I'm going to put that in here. And now we want a name for this, and I'm going to just put the text in directly in here. I'm going to call it first object. If you looked at the other examples that we just had open before, it had all this other code in here. So you can load the text that you use in any of your plugins from external resource files, and I'll go through that later on. I won't go through that now. I'll just keep things simple for now. We want to generate an object, so we're going to call this an object generator. If we right click on that, object generator produces a polygon or spline representation on its own, e.g. a primitive cube. So what that means is that when it gets this flag, it expects this class that we're writing to be able to create and return either a polygon or a spline object. And there's lots of other types that you can use, including particle modifiers. You can create an input, use it as an input, I won't get into that, but that's for deformers. And modifiers is basically a deformer. So we just want to generate an object. So we're going object generator. And now we want to pass in that static class static function that we made in the header file. So that's this one here. And you see it's called alloc. And because we've declared it as static, we can call that anywhere we want outside of the class, if that makes sense. So by writing the name of the class, 2 colons and an alloc, that allows you to essentially call this method. And what this method is going to return is a new instance of this first object. So this is essentially allowing it to create a copy of itself, and it passes the copy back to this function and it stores that copy inside this method. And what it actually does is this method is actually storing, this might be a little bit confusing, it's actually storing a reference to the function itself. So this isn't even being called right now. What this function will do is register this function, and it will allow Cinema 4D to then call this anytime it wants to create a new cube. And so when Cinema 4D calls this function, it's then going to return a new object of type first object. So it's going to create a brand new one of these and add it to the object manager, and then you'll see it. A little bit confusing there. I hope you understood some of that. You may be wondering, what's node data? And why is it creating a new first object, but it's returning a node data? So much like first object is derived from object data. So first object is a type of object data. Just like humans are a kind of type of mammal. Or you can imagine this being a Nissan, and this is a car. So a Nissan is a type of car. But also, this object data is derived from something itself. So it's derived from node data. So this object is a type of node data. It's derived from node data. And that also means that first object is derived from node data. So when you pass this back as node data, whoever's getting a hold of this is effectively not caring that it's object data or a first object. It's just going to deal with it as if it's just node data, and Cinema 4D, in fact, will just record it as node data, and it will only call these methods here. But because we have told it that it's actually an object generator, and we've registered it with register object, Cinema 4D knows that it can actually, even though it's maybe storing it internally like this, it can access it as if it's an object data. So internally it will actually access it like this. I'm not explaining this too well, but I just kind of want to give you a brief, simplistic explanation, if I can, of anything that we're kind of looking at. You can look more into this. It's called it's called you can look more into this. It's called object-oriented programming, and polymorphism is what you're actually using here in Cinema 4D. And it's also called, you also can look up inheritance as well. So this is just did a random Google on hierarchical inheritance. Here you can see a little diagram here. So this is our node data, and this is our object data. So object data is a type of A, B is a type of A, and then on top of that we've got another level where we've got our first object is derived as well. Anyway, let's just get back to the code, and all that means is that when we call this method, Cinema 4D is able to call that, and it's able to return a copy of this and do something with it. Now, at the moment, we're not dealing with the descriptions, so I'm just going to leave this. I'll type this in actually. O first object. I'll come back to what this means later on. But now we'll just continue on. This is allocating a bitmap. So if you want to have an icon show up, then this allows you to do that. Maybe I will jump straight into the resource stuff. Actually, no, I'll come back to that as well. But this is how you add icons. And again, these icons, they're located in the resource folders, which I'm not describing in this. So I'm just going to type in null pointer for that. So that means there's going to be no icon for this. And in fact, I might even just leave that empty as well. I'm just going to see if this actually works, if it'll let me allocate it without any resource description, because it might not. But this is the minimum that you need for that object just to kind of make something happen. And if we were to add one to our scene, it would end up coming up with the name of first object. And so now we actually want to do this. We want to add this to our scene. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to come into main.cpp. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go back down into here. I'm going to add one more file. So C, code, SDK, plugins, first plugin, source. I'm going to add a new file called main.h. I'm going to use this to store all of my declarations to the register methods. So I'll just run my project tool again and reload all. Now we've got the header file in there, and I've called it mail. So I'm just going to rename that to main. Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing here, if not defined main. And now I'm going to paste in that function name there into the header file here. And this is, we're also going to have to include the C4D file for the bool. And that's a declaration, a pre-declaration of the function name. And now in the main.cpp, if we were to go include main.h, and we can do that as the first one actually. And because main.h is including c4d.h, we can also remove that as well. And when we come down to plugin start, I'm also going to go, and I'm going to clean this up a little bit actually. I'm just going to remove that, put that on one line, just make it a little bit cleaner. If not register first object, return false. So if our plugin, when it starts up, it can't register that first object because someone has potentially reused this ID, then we don't want it to be continuing. So that's all we need there to get that registered. But I also want to just break this out into its own file as well. So we've got a similar situation here happening. We've got a register method, we've got our command. So I'm going to break that out into a first command file. I'm just going to see if there's a method in here that lets me do this. Quick actions refactoring. Extract function. Now, this isn't something I use normally. Okay, it just didn't work. I thought I'd just try that and see if it worked. So I'm going to create a new method, a new function, a new file. Again, I should bookmark this. Source and new file called first command, and make that a .h, and rename this to .cpp, and then we rerun the batch file. Discard my changes, and here we have our first command. So I'm just going to copy that across as well and clean up this file. So I grab all of this, including its ID, actually including, I'll get rid of that afterwards, going into my first command, pasting that in. I'm going to go into my header file as well and paste it in there, and then remove that from the top. Hash if not defined first command. Again, this text can be anything, it just needs to be unique within your file. And I do need that include from main.cpp. first dialog, and I'm going to come over to the first command and add that to here. And then I'm going to clean this up so it's just got the methods in there. And I don't need this in there. Okay, so that's your basic class. I've just cleaned it all up. And so now I come over to the CPP file, and I'm going to turn these into functions. And then at the top, we need to include first command. And now we're going to take this here and we're going to copy that to our main.h. And then we're going to just go to main CPP and we'll see that that's now okay. So if we were to compile this now, everything should compile fine. I've got Cinema 4D open, so I'll just close that. And now if I go up to right click, customize, well actually I can just go Control C, Shift C. So I'm holding down Shift and pressing C. If you don't want to do that, you can go customize palettes and you can type it in here as well. And we want first command, my first command. And, not command, first object we called it. So I can click this and it adds it to your scene. Now it's not going to do anything at the moment, but that is an instance of our class. And if I just delete this actually and come back into here and go to the solution Explorer, I want this to be docked always, and click on first object and put a breakpoint in here, and I'll put a breakpoint in the constructor as well, and I'll also see if I can put a breakpoint on this line here. So now I come down, I'm just going to restart Cinema 4D actually, so I'm going to shut that down, and I'm going to run it again. So when we start up Cinema 4D, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to register this object. So this method will get called. And if I was just to press F10 to step over it, you see it's been called from our plugin start. Press F5 to continue. And now we're in here, and now I want to add one of those. Shift C, first object. And now it's calling the allocation method from inside of Cinema 4D. So now Cinema 4D is wanting to create one of these first objects. The constructor is being run, so it's actually initializing anything that is required. And now it's added to the scene. So that's not too interesting at the moment, so we'll just close that down. So what we want is we want to be able to create a cube. So let's come down and have a look at what we searched before. So again, this was just, if I go to the header file, I'm just searching for anyone else who has written an example that contains public object data. And so I'm just going to scroll down until I see one that's kind of interesting. Rounded tube is probably what I want. And there's a method in here that I'm looking for called get virtual objects. So I'm just going to copy that and go back to our class, our header file, and paste that in here. And I'm also going to go to the CPP file and paste that here as well, and then set that up. Remove virtual. So let's just go back to that rounded tube example, and I'm just finding that method. So this example here, if you wanted to, you may even be able to just copy a lot of this. No, you can't, sorry. But this is creating, this is something that we're going to do, sort of. We're going to create our own cube and return it. And you can find these examples to find how they do something more complex. And I'll get to these later on, but this is showing how you can get, all the different information from the object that would be displaying when you have it selected. What I was wanting to do is grab this, but I'm going to grab this later. So let's just go back in here. Now I'm just going to cheat right now. I'm just going to say when you call first object, it actually returns an actual new cube. So we're going to say base object star p cube equals base object alloc o cube. Now you learned that from the first tutorial. And then we're just going to return that. So we're just going to create that object and return it. But one thing that Cinema 4D does is it tracks to see if some of its data has changed. And all of these objects, they store their data in the base containers that we talked about briefly in one of the other tutorials. And if none of that data changes, then Cinema 4D just thinks that the object is still the same. Now its matrix might change, so potentially it might, it'll be moving and rotating. But if nothing else is changing, then Cinema 4D can cache the object that is returned, so that it doesn't have to keep reallocating a new one every single time that it calls this method. And it will call this method a lot. It will call this method anytime anything changes in the scene, every frame, to try and get the data for your first object. So we don't really need it to create this cube over and over and over and over, but we need to tell Cinema 4D that that's okay. So I'm coming back to that rounded tube get virtual objects method, and you'll see here this method. And what this is doing is it's saying to check the cache, and it checks the cache for what it calls a dirty value, to see if something is actually changed in this object's hierarchy. And because you may have nested this object underneath other objects, or something may be underneath this object that's influencing it. And so it checks its hierarchy to see if anything has changed. And it also checks the dirty flag of the data. So this is that base container information from the base object, which in this case is these things here. Now if any of that changes, or any of this changes, then it'll run this code, because it's saying if not dirty, then run that. But if it is dirty, if it is dirty, then you need to recreate it again. So let's just copy these bits here. Again, I'm in roundedtube.cpp, which I found by searching for public object data, and it's found in Cinema 4D's SDK source object rounded tube. And you just copy that, go back to your first object, and just paste that at the top. So again, this is going to say, it's going to ask if this object has its cache changed, has its information been dirtied. If not, then we can return the object's cache. So just, I guess we'll just put a breakpoint, and we'll just show you what that means. So the first time it will create it, but then if we were to do anything else in the scene, it will just return this cache here. I'll put a breakpoint there as well. So I'm just pressing F9 to create these breakpoints. And let's just press F5, and we'll compile that, and we'll run that and see how that works. Now at the moment we're just creating the basic cube, but later on I'll demonstrate how to, in the next tutorial, I'll demonstrate how to actually create this cube object ourselves as well. So we're just cheating at the moment by passing in a cube. But we will get down to the nitty-gritty of vertices and everything else. Okay, so we're in here, and I'm going to type Shift-C and go first object. Actually, what I will do, I'm going to dock this. Okay, this is our own startup layout. I'm going to right-click, customize palette, first object, and drag this up here. And it puts a little cogwheel, which basically means it just doesn't have a icon. I think I can right-click, and we'll change that just to text. That changes everything to text. So we'll right click again and we'll show that without the text. I'm going to right click and create new palette, drag that onto here, or actually double click that, I single click that, we're in there, we're doing our thing. I was editing the UI. Let me just take those breakpoints out. So I'm getting sidetracked a little bit here. So customize palettes. When that is open, you can double click on these to remove them. But this dialog needs to be open. And now I can type first object and I can drag it into here. To there, and now I can right click on this and I can say show as text, and I can remove the icon as well. And now I can dock that into my interface straight there. And we'll close that. Window, customization, save as startup layout. So this is our startup layout. We've got our button docked. That was a bit long-winded. So let's go back to here and I'm going to put those breakpoints back in. Again, I'm just pressing F9. And now in Cinema 4D, I'm going to click first object. So the first time comes through, it says dirty. It says yes, it is dirty, because this is the very first time this has ever been created. So when that happens, it says that everything's dirty, it needs to be updated. So we step over it, it steps over that if statement, it creates a cube and it returns it. If we go back to Cinema 4D, we see we now got a cube. Now I move my mouse over the screen there, and because of that, Cinema 4D wants to update. It wants to check the status. So it's going in and it's calling this again. Anytime something happens in Cinema 4D, it will call this again. So now it's calling get virtual objects. Is it dirty? False. Nothing has changed. So now it's stepped through. It's calling get cache. So it's getting the previous copy that we just allocated of that cube, and it's returning that. So I just pressed F5 until it got to this state. Now I'm not moving my mouse at all, and you can see that it's still in here. But if I was to move my mouse over the screen, this gets called again. So let's just take out these breakpoints. So, but we can safely see there that it's calling get cache when anything is happening. And let's just put a breakpoint down here so we know when it actually is creating a brand new object. Okay. So it doesn't create it when I click off it or on it. It doesn't create it when I move it or scale it. Actually, it's not even going to let me scale it, because we need to grab the information from the internal object that's referencing this before we can actually scale. So let's just also try deleting it. It didn't call our method, undelete. So when we undelete, now it's calling it and getting a new cube again.